I know there's going to be people listening to this um, saying, "Well, this is Russia's fault. They shouldn't have invaded. Like there was no need. That there was that they started this war, right? And to say that the lives or the blood of 200,000 Ukrainians rests on the shoulders of or on the hands of Boris Johnson and Vladimir Zelensky, that would seem like a slightly outrageous statement to perhaps some people who maybe haven't been paying as close attention to it as you. So why, in a nutshell, would you say that they are responsible for these deaths?
Okay, that's an excellent question. Let me give you a little history. At the end of World War II, the United States looked at the Soviet Union as a potential competitor. And even though nominally we were supposed to be allies with Soviet Union, in fact, the United States was setting up to literally attack Russia. George Patton wanted to continue to the east. Okay, very few people are aware of that, but Patton wanted to. Once he got through with the Germans, he wanted to go through with the Russians. But what people don't realize is the Russians killed 90% of the Germans who died in combat during World War II were killed by the Russians in the Soviet Union. One of the things that's interesting is that the biggest war crimes took place on the Eastern Front, and there were at least 100,000 Jews and Poles and Russians murdered in cold blood by the Nazis. What nobody mentions today is they weren't German Nazis, they were Ukrainian Nazis. When Germany marched into Ukraine, they were welcomed with open arms by the Ukrainians who hate the Russians. So at the end of World War II, there were some terrible war crimes that had been committed by the Ukrainian Nazis, and there was not a single Ukrainian Nazi charged with war crimes. There has effectively been a war going on by the United States against USSR, first of all, and then Russia now, since then. Now let's fast forward to 2014. Victoria Nuland and the United States and the CIA sponsored a coup d'etat, and they overthrew the democratically elected government of Ukraine, which favored Russia. But because they favored Russia, the United States was against them. So the United States and Victoria Nuland, you can go to YouTube and find it. Victoria Nuland brags about the United States having spent $5 billion to bring democracy to Ukraine. Well, a lot of the $5 billion ended up in the oligarchs' hands and in Zelensky's hands. After the coup d'etat and after the murder of 44 people in Odessa in the trade unions building by the Nazis, and these are very real Nazis, these aren't neo-Nazis, these are real Nazis, Donbass voted in an independent election and said, we don't want to be part of that government. And they actually went to the Russians and said, we would like to join Russia because we are Russians. And Putin and the Russians said, no, you're Ukrainian, okay? And you could be independent of the government, but you're still Ukrainian. Now, Putin did seize Crimea, but Crimea's been part of Russia since 1783. The election in 2014 in Donbass was internationally supervised, and something above 90% of people voted to have independence from the illegal Ukrainian government. So there were two governments involved. There was the illegal Ukrainian government, and then there was democracy in Donbass. And of course, nobody in the United States or the CIA or NATO is going to admit It was a democratic election, and they said, we don't want to be part of the thugs. Ukraine attacked Donbass between 2014 and 2022. There were 14,000 mostly civilians killed in Donbass. Nobody shed a tear over them. The Ukrainians were attacking civilian targets. They were not attacking military targets. That was not a military expedition. It was a deliberate effort to terrorize civilians. If you go back to February of 2022, on February 17th or 19th, Zelensky actually said that he wanted Ukraine to have nuclear weapons. And he said he fully intended to have Ukraine join NATO. Now, 30 years ago, at the separation of Germany, when the reunification talks took place, the United States, let me think of who was involved. I think it was just the United States and the USSR, agreed in writing that NATO would not move 1 inch to the east. Since then, NATO has added 14 countries to the east, to the extent that Putin is absolutely correct in saying the intent is to threaten Russia. Putting nuclear weapons in Ukraine would be a red line that absolutely the Russians would not, could not possibly tolerate. And Putin made that clear, and the West ignored him. Well, after 2014, when the Ukrainians attacked Donbass, the fighting went on for 2 years, and there was a peace treaty called Minsk II that was supervised by the French, the British, the Americans, and the Germans that said Ukraine would stop shelling Donbass and there would be fair elections in Donbass to see who represented the people. And of course, Poroshenko has now admitted that they lied. They had no intention whatsoever of implementing Minsk II, and instead they were preparing for an attack. And nobody says this because it wasn't in the mainstream media, but Ukraine had 100,000 troops on the border of Donbass, and they were going to invade Donbass about March 10th. So instead of this being an aggressive move by Putin, it was actually self-defense on the part of Putin. The aggression was on the part of the US, NATO, and Ukraine. The war actually ended from a military point of view in the first week. When you gain air control over a territory, you control that territory. It should have ended in March, and Boris Johnson went to Kiev, talked to Zelensky, and said, we're going to give you all the weapons you want, and we're quite willing to fight to the last drop of Ukrainian blood. And since Zelensky's former occupation was a comedian and who has made over $1 billion raping the people of Ukraine, Zelensky said, fine, you keep shipping weapons and we'll keep shipping troops and burying them when they get killed by the Russians. I believe the kill ratio is 8 or 10 to 1. The Russians have always been winning this thing. They're going to win it. It literally is a question of life or death for the Russians. They cannot have a nuclear-armed Ukraine next door, period. So there is no situation in which the Russians will ever back down. And the last thing they would do if some magical reason NATO and Europe got together and actually defeated the Russians, the last thing he would do is push a button. And that would end the world, which I would be against.
Well, yeah, hopefully. Hey everyone, thanks for making it right the way to the end of the podcast. I love that you tuned in this long. Do me a favor, hit subscribe, because 80% of you bastards are not subscribing, but you're watching my videos. See you next time.